The Pattaya City Expats Club is a non-profit social organisation and our speakers are volunteers. The club as such assumes no responsibility or liability for the professional reputation of or the quality of services provided by the speaker today.
I have to say I'm a little disappointed in this talk. Not the talk, but the timing. Because the 11th of the 11th this year is actually on a Wednesday, and so we're hoping to have a talk on that day about service. But we're very lucky. I always feel very privileged when people come in and talk about their service to their country and serving in the military. It's a very special privilege that they're willing to share that journey. And today one of our favourite sons, Anderson, Dave Anderson, is actually going to be giving a talk on his service in the US Air Force and flying the biggest plane in the world at the time, etc. So a huge round of applause to our serviceman, Dave Anderson.
I want to thank the club for this opportunity. In preparing for this, it brought back a lot of emotions from my Vietnam days. So I'm going to divide my talk into three parts. First experience flying was as a navigator. Then I went to pilot training and flew in Germany for 4 years. And the last 10 years, I flew the C-5 in Dover. So excuse me if I run very quickly over my Vietnam experience. It really pulled a lot of things I'd put away back up again. First slide, please. I came from a very loyal, I think, good-hearted people in North Dakota, in my hometown especially, where loyalty to the country was something they were very proud of, and I am too. And so when it came to the draft, a lot of talk about how to avoid it. I couldn't avoid it, so I did not feel bad at all about volunteering for the Air Force because I always wanted to fly anyway. But that meant I would go to basic training before I had a later opportunity for officer training. Basic training I thought of as very hands-on. It was a good wake-up call for a kid from a small town and a small college. The day before our graduation parade, our wonderful sergeant came in, and his normal nice voice and encouraging personality said, "Anderson, pack your bags in 5 minutes and get outside, you're going to OTS." So I think it was only 3 minutes before I was out at the curb waiting for a pickup truck. Officer training school was a whole different attitude, atmosphere. It was a great school, leadership, and so on. Someone in the big universe decided that I had pretty good aptitude for flying, my total notes. And so I went to navigator training. Navigator school, I thought I was pretty much done with academics, but it turned out my stack of books on my first day in the BOQ was about this high. So it was a very technical, a lot of math involved, which I was pretty good at, luckily. It was great training. Took your final check ride. I graduated pretty high in my class. And so I chose, for the next slide, to go to a C-130 at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. It turned out the training that I'd received was really top-notch. As soon as I learned the knobs and switches on the C-130, I was sent on a multiple-leg training exercise. I came back, took a check ride. I was good to go as far as over water. Then came the Christmas season with little flying and also bad weather. And I happened to be selected, being the only second lieutenant in the entire squadron. Somehow I got to be the night duty officer on December 31st. But it turned out to be a night to remember. There was a hotline for emergencies, the red phone. And about 7:30 that evening, the fog was so thick I couldn't even see the lights on the ramp. the red phone rang, and you checked in as your squadron was called, and then you got the message. There's been an accident, the base is closed, and it's on lockdown. Okay. About 3 hours later, the red phone rang again, and they said the base is now open, the aircraft accident is under investigation. The next morning, I found out that there were 5 pilots from headquarters TAC, which was co-located at Langley, who had left it to the last minute to get their 4 hours a month flight pay, flying for flight pay. They'd really left it late. In fact, they came in about 7:30 at night. It was below minimums. They could have gone to their alternate, but chose not to. They shot approach after approach, getting a little lower, ducking a little lower, and finally had a collision with the approach lights. Everyone was killed. Meanwhile, their wives were at the officers' club, along with their dress uniforms, waiting for them to show up. I called that get-home-itis, and I tried to caution most of the guys I flew with and all the guys that I later trained about the dangers of get-home-itis. Right after the Christmas season, again, the weather was very bad. It was hard to fly, 500 feet, terrain following. If you'd give us the next slide. This is the way we would train, a 3-ship formation. I was the only navigator under training, so I always flew in the lead. We had 6 co-pilots that were also in training, all of whom outranked me, though. So I flew a lot, and they flew quite a bit, and we dodged the weather. At one point, we went down to Dyess Air Force Base, Texas, and flew. It would look just like this. It was winter, but it was dry and good visibility. So we all got checked out, and I got put up for a check ride. I think I took my check ride on a Tuesday. The next day, I got certified by somebody at wing headquarters. The next day, we had a briefing on deployment. And I can't remember if I had one day off before we deployed or it was right the next day. But there we go. Next slide, please. Bouncing our way across the Pacific all the way to Daegu, Korea. 5 legs, first out to California, then to Hawaii, then to Wake Island, a real pleasure place, and then into Japan and finally to Korea, where when we got there that afternoon, it was very, very cold. Our supposed housing were cubicles, prefab. They weren't quite finished, so we had to pound a few nails and get into quarters. The next day it was planned to get ready for this big drop. It was all going to be part of Focus Retina 1969. The heart of that was supposed to be 44 C-141s who flew all the way to Korea from Pope Air Force Base in scheduled relays. And in 31 hours, they were supposed to be making drops over Korea to show our support for the Koreans in case we needed to reinforce them on short notice. But our squadron and the other C-130 squadron had deployed early, as well as 600 troops, at least that was our load, of the 82nd Airborne. Next slide, please. Well, we finally got to fly. We went over to, I think it was Osan, but I'm not 100% sure of that. We picked up our 600 troops spread out in our 18 airplanes, taxied out for timed takeoff. This is probably what it would have looked like as our squadron, the whole squadron, taxied out. And the lead, of course, and the lead navigator figured out our controlled takeoff time to make a time over target, because there were going to be 5 waves of planes going over this drop zone in about an hour's time. I think we were the last to drop, but I'm not sure. Next slide, please. We took off and went into a formation that, this is my hand drawing. I'm not sure. Oh, I guess it shows up okay. Anyway, we started in kind of a loose formation as we rejoined. Squadron commander, I thought it was kind of weak at the time, flew tail end Charlie in number 18. But it became evident the reason he did it was he coached everybody into a tighter and tighter formation. When I think about it, probably none of the, or maybe only one or two of the pilots had ever flown in a large formation. So he picked a very good spot. And the ops officer, who's very highly experienced, C-130, led the formation. My aircraft commander, who happened to be the chief pilot, we were number 15. Next slide, please. Now this is another hand-drawn slide, and I made a mistake in drawing it. The green smoke, or the point of impact, should be up here, not on the leading edge, because that's how you were scored. This line across here was where your first troopers landed. That was your drop score. It's kind of a busy slide. At this point, each aircraft commander is trying to follow the lead. It was a little bit tricky because we had a crosswind, but lead set us up really good to track over, and the commander had gotten us into a very nice tight formation. Now the individual navigators now had already set up, this was my timing point, and I set my stopwatch, I still remember, for 43 seconds. And when I corrected my view behind the pilot for that small drift correction, when I was exactly abeam that spot, I hit the stopwatch. And at that time, my attention now, I had the stopwatch, and I'm looking at the drop zone, and all of a sudden the troops come out of the plane, the closest in front of us, which was number 12. And I think I kind of jumped because they were so darn close. But of course they went down and we didn't run over them. And then my eye went to the green smoke on the point of impact, and it was laying very close to the ground. We'd been warned that perhaps the altitude winds were higher than the reported winds, which were reported as the maximum allowable for dropping troops. And so when I saw those parachutes all short of the point of impact, I said, everybody's dropping short. So I'll add 3 seconds. That's about 300 meters. And when my stopwatch ran out, I had to switch to the high-tech method, 1001, 1002, 1003, green light. And then we went through the drop zone, did the standard departure procedure, and went single ship back to Taegu. Next slide, please. This is what it would have looked like from the ground. A lot of parachutes, a lot of planes, a lot of people watching. But no matter how good your formation was, you only got graded on that line across the green smoke. That actually was a picture of one of our squadron planes. There's also C-141s who drop both troops and heavy equipment. If you see a double parachute, that's the heavy equipment. And you can see one pallet coming down. Well, when we got back to Taegu, we went to the dining hall / officers club, and I think we all had a drink, and we're glad that was over. The drop report kind of filtered in a little at a time. The first we heard was everybody was okay. There were no serious injuries, which, are there any paratroopers here? Out of 600 people that dropped with no injuries, would that be pretty darn good? I think so too. In any case, the next thing that we heard was that there was one hung trooper, and it happened to be the squadron commander, the last airplane. So he had to do an orbit and come back over the drop zone, and the trooper that was hung put his hand on his head, indicating, I've got my reserve ready, cut me loose. So when they came over the drop zone, that's what they did. And he did survive. He was a little beat up, but he survived. So the training took over and worked the way it's supposed to work. The next thing that we heard was that one of the airplanes, not everybody jumped. Apparently, the fifth guy, the last of the five guys, one fell down near the door. The others kind of piled on top of him. And so those guys had to go back to their onload base and probably didn't meet a very nice reception. Then the squadron commander came in. The room was called to attention. He walked in, surveyed everybody before he said, "Take your seats," which not really normal. And he looked pretty grumpy when he came in, maybe because of that hung trooper, but then when he addressed us, we knew why. I had some nice words about how his tone was. Oh yes, he berated the squadron in rather graphic terms about our lousy drop scores. Then he said, "Who is the aircraft commander of number 15? And my pilot stood up and said, "Major Plotkin, sir," and saluted. And he said, "Plotkin, who is your navigator?" He says, "Well, that was Lieutenant Anderson, sir." Kind of a long pause. He said, "Well, you got the only goddamn point of impact in the whole damn squadron." And he stomped out. So that was a pretty big experience for me. Next slide, please. It wasn't long after we got back to Langley that I kind of found out how the Air Force machine worked to get people to go to Vietnam. I was only back a couple months from this Korean adventure, and I got orders for a 6-month TDY to Cam Bay. Interestingly enough, the pilot that I flew to Korea with also took that assignment. And so we were joined by 2 members of the other squadron, a second navigator and a co-pilot. And we went over first to Japan, where the pilots were checked out on a little bit different airplane that we were going to fly, and we got briefed up on secrecy and stuff like that. Our mission was high altitude electronic reconnaissance along the perimeters of Vietnam, North Vietnam. When we got down to Cam Bay, we were further briefed, and for security reasons, they didn't want us to talk to the back end guys at all, or them to talk to us. So we had 25 to 30 people in the back of the airplane listening for electronic signals, and it was never clear, but maybe voice signals as well. And we were not to talk to each other, no mission discussions, which became a kind of an irritating point for the front end crews, because we didn't know if we were really doing any good or not. We flew off the coast of North Vietnam and in the Gulf of Tonkin, and we would go as far north as Abeam, Hanoi. But when we did go that far north, we had 4 Navy F-4s flying fighter cap for us. The other major mission, it took a little longer to get on station there, so the 8 hours on station got to be close to a 12-hour mission. That was over Laos, very close to Thailand, and we were picking up emissions and whatever we could off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Next slide, please. This is the plane that we did it in. It was called a C-130B-2. The B comes from the lack of, I don't know if this will work this way. Can you see that? There's no fuel tank here. And you can see extra antennas, and there's more on the side you can't see, where the intercept people worked. It could fly higher. That's why it had this mission, because it was a lighter airplane. Next slide, please. We flew for about 4 months, not really knowing whether we were doing any good or not, because they didn't brief us on their mission. But at a certain point, we had to shut down an engine, maybe 5 hours into our orbit, and the AC told Bat 1, the guy in charge and back, that we were going to have to RTB, return to base. And Bat 1 came back and said, geez, can you guys stay? We got 2 Americans on the ground. They just bailed out, and there's bad guys all around them trying to set up a trap for the rescue forces, and we're the only thing between them. We're jamming their signals, we're spoofing them, trying to lead them astray. But until the ABCCC, the Airborne Command Post, gets here, we're it. So we all looked at each other, nodded our heads, we're going to stay. So we did a couple more. We were almost right over the activity. We did a few more back and forths. ABCCC came on frequency, started to control the flight. We didn't want to be in the area and get in the way, so we started heading home. He started giving directions. I remember the first part of it before we got out of range. He was very terse. He said, all right, all you fighters, if you don't have an hour's loiter time, go home. The rest of you got ordnance, go to this frequency and report what you got. And then he changed to another frequency to control the fight itself. I didn't get much of that. However, I'll tell you about the outcome because I read the summary later on. Next slide, please. I'd made first lieutenant on that tour. I went back to Langley, found I was in a new squadron because our old squadron had been deactivated. And it was only a couple more months before they discovered I didn't have a long tour, so I was assigned for a 1-year tour this time. And the orders were to a specialized unit that used terrain following radar and Skyhook, which was the Fulton recovery system. So I went to Pope Air Force Base, joined a new crew there. We learned how to do all those things. And when you go TDY to Vietnam, you don't go through survival school. But when you go on a 1-year tour, now you got to go through all the survival schools. So water survival, normal survival, and jungle survival school in the Philippines, and then commercial over to Cameron and helicopter ride to Nha Trang and be the new guy again. Next slide, please. This is the airplane this is a newer model of the airplane that we flew. You can see it had a different paint job, darker than most C-130s. Now, this one has an additional radar, which we did not have. This is their mapping radar, and the terrain following radar was up here. And there's a few other things you can't see on this. I'll mention them as we go along. Next slide, please. I joined the 15th SOS, Special Operations Squadron. Now, on the Air Force charts, it did show up as a subsidiary unit of the 14th Special Operations Wing, but that was just fake. We really worked for Military Advisory Command Vietnam Studies and Observation Group, meant to sound like a bunch of bookkeepers and historians to lead anybody astray of what our real mission was. We got several mission briefings, all of which emphasized the secret nature of our job. I always remember part of it was, don't ask another crew what they did, they won't tell you, and don't talk to strangers. And although I'll tell you about the junior man bit in a moment. Next slide. Now, this is a beach party that we had where basically everyone's out of uniform. That's my aircraft commander, and he's in uniform, so we must have been the duty crew that day. But this gentleman, a full colonel from the 14th Wing, came down to get familiar with our unit. But we were told, don't talk to this guy. Turn your back on him. He can't get on one of our planes. He can't go in our building, and he'll get the message and leave pretty soon, which, being a smart guy, he did. And we never had any problems. Next slide, please. The junior officer on each of the 6 crews was the duty driver of the day that your crew was on duty. Really didn't amount to much. Our major duty was to take the movie back to the Army from the night before that we'd shown at the Officers Club and pick up the new movie, and that night become the projectionist. I was very fortunate. I had, MASH, which had been kind of suppressed in the military system for a while, and then General Patton. What's the movie about General Patton? So those were super interesting to us, and I felt fortunate to be the projectionist. The next slide, please. Now, when we flew, most of our flying was done in support of the Green Berets and the Vietnamese Rangers. We wore Nomax flight suits, which were fairly new at that time, with no patches, no identification. This is a picture of me in the radar section. That's our radar. This was the Doppler navigation, which was okay but not great. And back here, this is the Loran set that we used for overwater navigation. If you were to draw a curtain across this where you couldn't see anybody, when we went into our low-level ops, that curtain was pulled so that the outside navigator, myself usually, and the pilots could darken down so our night vision would be as effective as possible. Next slide, please. We had 6 crews. The Army would come up with mission requirements probably every 5 to 7 days. And they had to put a lot of training into their deep insertion people, which consisted of 2 Americans and anywhere from 4 to 6 indigenous, which I later learned were mostly South Vietnamese Rangers. And they were big guys. They weren't the little skinny ARVN soldiers that you sometimes see portrayed. I was a pretty big guy, and they were as big as I was, some of them. In any case, the mission planning for one of those inserts started 2 days ahead of time, where we'd plan up the mission according to the Army requirements, which would include 2 or 3 fake drops somewhere in the same country that we were flying over, and then the real drop. Then at the end of that day, that would be transmitted or gotten to Saigon somehow, I'm not sure, in that transfer, and they would deconflict it so that we wouldn't get shot down by our own forces or have bombs dropped on us by our own airplanes. And then we'd get that back the next day, and we'd go over it if there were any changes that we had to make. Sometimes there were, and any late intelligence that we needed. That there wasn't much that would have affected us because we were supposed to be so secret and invisible. The day of the mission, we basically did nothing. We tried to stay out of the sun as much as possible so our eyes would adjust as quickly as possible to the darkness of the cockpit, and the radar nav would be the only one. It was usually our senior nav who flew the radar. It was a lousy radar for mapping. It required a lot of skill from him interpreting things. But it was a great radar for terrain following, although it was a very high workload for the pilots when we were down in the weeds in the soup at 500 feet in unknown terrain. They were flying, if anybody knows what a localizer approach is, it gives you horizontal and vertical information overlaid over a map showing the peaks and valleys very close to you. So the nav and the pilots had to work, the radar nav and the pilots worked very closely together. Most of the time I was in front of the screen, and I'm looking for any landmarks to help the navigation, which were darn few when we're over in bad guy country. Next slide, please. Now, this is the uniform we wore on our true combat missions. We were supposed to be unidentifiable. We had no identification. We wore these random uniforms. This is my aircraft commander. This is one of our co-pilots. The other one is taking the pictures. There's me, the senior nav. And this guy is our electronic warfare officer, which was one of the unusual positions for a C-130. We also, in the enlisted force, we had a radio operator who could work classified, at least at the technical level that we had in those days, radio. We also had the FM radio set to the same frequency that the team we were going to drop. In the inset picture, I wasn't technically, I made that by mistake. I couldn't get rid of it. But anyway, it's a good picture showing us at either a Green Beret small base or possibly a Ranger base. There's a couple of Vietnamese there, and I don't know who the person with the flight suit on. I don't think it was a member of our crew. Maybe it was the point of contact at that base. Next. I was offered and accepted a regular commission during that one-year tour. A big step for a young officer. Next slide, please. The previous slide, the daytime trip, we took a team over to Thailand and dropped them off in whatever sequency we could manage in the daytime. They were going to be inserted somewhere by other means. Could have been helicopter, walking in, I don't know what else it could have been. I don't think it was by boat. This is the good depiction of a C-130 with a Fulton Air Recovery System with its feelers out. Next slide. The idea was you're picking up somebody deep in enemy territory or someone who was unavailable in any other way of extracting them. So a fast mover airplane could drop in this pallet, and if the timing was right, next slide, these are coming fast, the person would read the instructions, put on the suit, hook up to the inflation bags, next slide, and it would result in blowing up this big balloon, which would go up about 600 feet. If the timing was good, the C-130 would come right in with its feelers out, intercept the line. Next slide. The line would slide down the feelers into what we called the teacup, which would lock the line. Next slide. And it would lift the guy off the ground, and they would oscillate up 700 or 800 feet, but slowly it would smooth out. Next slide. And he'd be reeled in as that was happening. This is probably, he's 50 feet or 100 feet behind the plane. Loadmasters would continue reeling him in. Next slide. And he'd be happy. At this slide, he's back on the ramp being hooked up to straps, and he's not going to fall off. And it was often, I made 2 live pickups like this, but not in combat as demonstration. I say I was the navigator. I played a very small role in this. I had a role, but it was very small. This was all pilots, and our guys were very highly skilled, both at this and in terrain following. We had great crews. It was great crew cooperation. Next slide. Additional duties, junior officers get lots of extra things to do. One of mine was assistant civic actions officer. And I read an article in the Stars and Stripes about we had captured a bunch of Cambodian rice close to the border, and they, instead of blowing it up, they decided to airlift it by heavy lift helicopters into Saigon, where it was put in warehouses. So I thought about the Catholic nuns who had an orphanage just nearby, which we'd been to several times to help them with their well or other small things. And I thought we could use that rice. So through channels and using my excuse or reason as civic actions, I was able to coordinate with our friends down at our Green Beret friends in Saigon, and we loaded and picked up and brought back 3 pallets of captured rice, probably about a total of 25,000 pounds, where we stored it on base and then parceled it out in smaller units out to the orphanage, because we didn't want to bring them a lot. There might be bad guys in the area who try to steal it or hold them up for something. Next slide, please. Now, in addition to those live pickups, I had one other kind of different mission. And it was to go over to Cambodia. We flew down to Saigon, picked up a palletized mobile TACAN, a tactical air navigation, which our fighters were going to need when they made the Cambodian incursion, which was an agreement that they could go 20 miles into Cambodia chasing bad guys instead of having to stop at the border. It applied to the Army as well as the Air Force. So we picked this thing up. It's very sensitive, I guess, politically. So we go to Phnom Penh. We have a Cambodian pilot in the cockpit with us who's going to talk us into the airport because we're going in at 2 o'clock in the morning, blacked out. And the runway was blacked out. So as he guides us in verbally, we get below 1,000 feet. Maybe we're down to 500 feet. And on his call, they turn on the runway lights. And we turn on our lights and we land and taxi into a very dark corner of their airport and offload this mobile TACAN to these guys we didn't recognize that were going to stay there with it, probably from a 3-letter organization starting with C. But anyway, that was a little break in our normal routine. I flew several other of those deep insert missions. I'm not going into any detail because it kind of brings back some deep memories that I thought I didn't have anymore. But in late November, we were assigned a trip. For the first time, I went deep into Cambodia. And in those days, we were restricted to dropping troops only if you could see the ground or the drop zone. So the monsoon had set in, and we were in really bad weather. There was a lot of rain at Nha Trang. We took off into a 300-foot overcast, flew the trip as planned, got down to 500 feet. I'm not seeing the ground as we made our run into the drop zone. At probably about the 2-minute warning, the pilots climbed to 800 feet for the drop altitude. They went off the back ramp, so they tended to drop as low as they could and stay together, 2 Americans and 4 to 5 indigenous. And so when the radar nav said, call it, I said, no drop, because I couldn't see the ground. We were just in total clouds, rain, lightning occasionally, and we took it all home. About 5 days later, maybe 4 days later, the ops officer calls us in and asks us if we'd be, instead of going on rotation to the next crew, if we'd be willing to refly the mission. And I know none of us wanted to do it, but we agreed to do it because we were supposedly familiar with the area, even though we couldn't see a damn thing. So we reflew the mission. And as we left one bad guy country and went over a mountain into another bad guy, Cambodia wasn't a bad guy, but it was so infiltrated with North Vietnamese that it was a bad guy area anyway. So we went over the mountain just like we'd had before. A certain area gave us the best chance to get down to low level quickly. But as we came over that mountain, they were lighting us up with a radar. There were flashes going off. There was lightning in the area without a doubt, but there were other flashes that I interpreted as exploding munitions. And I think they were shooting at us, but they were shooting at the sound of the airplane because they didn't have us, certainly not visually, and not on the radar, according to the electronic warfare officer. He couldn't jam it, but it wasn't any good anyway. It wasn't a tracking radar. So we dropped down to 500 feet. We're tracking into the drop zone. 2-minute warning, they climbed to 800 feet. I couldn't see anything at 500, certainly couldn't see anything at 800, but when he said call it, I said green light. And our guys went off the back ramp and we did our exit maneuver, started back, and about 4 to 5 minutes later, on the FM radio that we were monitored, they were calling for extraction. Apparently we had dropped them a little too close to the area that they wanted to recon. It was a North Vietnamese base camp. I later talked to the team leader. He said, I landed in a big tree, lowered myself down. At the base of my tree was a picket. He was sleeping. He's still sleeping. So they went to their designated emergency pickup area, and our sister squadron, the Green Hornets, they got in and picked those guys up. Now they must have known every river, creek, tree, and blade of grass to be able to get into that area to pick them up, but they did it. Fantastic job. Which I'm having a senior moment here. Next slide. I think I left out the continuation of that story about the shoot down and attempted pickup. So I picked that up right now. When I was in jungle survival school, we had a break, and I found some summaries of previous rescue attempts. And so I combed through those and found that exact rescue. Once the airborne command post took over, he directed the fight. And the first Sandys, which a call sign you've just heard about recently, they were A-1E Sky Raiders from World War II, but they were a big, tough airplane and with lots of armament. The first flight of 4 Sandys came in and shot up the area, trying to disrupt this trap. And they called in the first Jolly Green Giant to pick up these 2 guys. The first one came in and got the heck shot out of him. And he didn't get a chance to even put down his jungle penetrator to pick somebody up. They got his hydraulics apparently, and he pulled off. He ended up controlled crash landing on the way back to Thailand, somewhere in Laos. So now the on-scene commander had brought in all kinds of other assets, fast movers, bombs of different kinds, strafe of different kind, another flight of Sandys. So they really, as we used to say, really hosed down the area, trying to make it as safe as possible. The second Jolly Green comes in, puts down his jungle penetrator. One of the guys hops on and they pick him up. But now they're taking a lot of fire and they have to retreat, and they end up going back to the same place the first one did. So it looks pretty bad for the second guy. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a black helicopter zooms in, throws out a rope. The guy gets the rope, wraps it around himself, gives him the thumbs up, and they lift him out at the end of this rope. And all of a sudden, there's this loud expletive, and then a silence, and somebody says, "What happened?" They shot him off the rope. Any chance he survived? Not from over 200 feet. So they got one, but lost one. As I learned later, within the next couple of days, yet another sister team, this one an Army team, walked in to that area in Laos and recovered that body. Leave no one behind. Well, I completed my tour, and it was time to go home. I got an early release so I could get home by Christmas. Our helicopter friends took me down to Cameron Bay. The next day, there were about 220 of us get on this charter airplane. Turns out that I and an Army captain were the only officers. We were both like 1 month as captains, so we were co-commanders of these troops. And so we fly up to Japan. We go into a building there. They refuel the airplane, change crews. We come back out, but we're missing somebody. So they start calling the roll. The flight attendants are trying to figure out who this is. There's one empty seat, which shouldn't have been empty. And about that time, 4 security police come on and talk to the flight attendant. "Have you got Private such and so?" They look at "Yes, we do." "No, you don't. We got him." So he sent his assistants back to that seat and area to search it for drugs. And I asked, "Well, what happened?" And he said, "Well, this guy couldn't wait until he got a fix of some kind of drugs. So he stuck a needle in his arm and injected himself, and he passed out, fell on the floor of the lav, was discovered. The medics saved his life, but we picked him up, and he's going to jail." So once that was resolved, we buttoned up and took off on what for most of us was a freedom flight. We all thought about it that way. And to me, this incident kind of represented how deep an effect the Vietnam War had on so many soldiers that served there. And then just now, or in preparing, I thought about, yes, what a tragedy, but we always must remember that there were 58,000, more than 58,000 soldiers and airmen who never came home. And the tragedy for their families is pretty hard to imagine. But for me, this was my freedom flight, and I was pretty happy because I was going to pilot training. I'd been selected and very fortunate, one of the few navigators who ever got to change to be a pilot. So next slide, please. Vance Air Force Base is where I was assigned, and your first opportunity to show your pilot skills is on the Cessna. We had civilian instructors whose job was really to evaluate your ability or potential to be a pilot in the Air Force. And traditionally, about 10% of the class never makes it past this point. And that was true in our class as well. Next slide, please. After the, one more, yeah. This is I think this was before my first solo flight in a T-37. That was your introduction to jets. A very good training airplane, and after a surprisingly few hours, you got to take one of these up for your first solo. Next slide, please. And on successfully completing, you got washed down and welcomed to the jet set. I don't know what the exact terminology was, but it was a tradition. And interesting, the guy hosing me down was from a town about 40 miles from where I grew up in North Dakota, from Fargo. I never knew him before pilot training. Next slide, please. As we finished T-37, we moved into T-38. It's a very hot, fast airplane, and most of the time we flew with an instructor, but near the end of our training, we were allowed a solo out and back. So I had my solo flight over to Amarillo Air Terminal, probably 30, 45 minutes. I think 5 of us went in a loose group with an instructor also accompanying us. And I remember very clearly getting cleared at Amarillo after refueling, taxi out, cleared for takeoff, caution, C5, 8-mile final, opposite direction. I looked up down the runway, and there's this huge airplane coming right at me. Now, it looked like he was on short final, but he was 7 or 8 miles away. So I hit the burners, took off, pulled it up in a very steep climb. I think I was up to 18 or 20,000 feet before I realized I still had it in afterburner, which you didn't even use it for normal takeoffs, but you had it. So we go back to Vance, and the weather was closing in a little bit at Vance, so when I contacted approach, they said, gave me a vector and said, stand by for a precision approach radar, PAR, caution, controller training in progress. And I completely used all my willpower to resist saying, caution, pilot training in progress. They were training foreign controllers as well as American pilots and some foreign pilots in handling airplanes. Next slide. I was pretty high in my class, and I got what I thought was going to be the most interesting assignment in our bunch. And I wanted to go to Germany. I'd been there for a few weeks on a TDY, and it just seemed like after Vietnam it would be a great place to go. I'm not sure how well it shows. Can you see here? Can you see here? It says United States of America. Well, normally it would say U.S. Air Force, but because of the diplomatic missions that we flew, that was the terminology, and that made it acceptable to certain countries that wouldn't take something with U.S. Air Force on it. Next slide, please. Germany, this is a slide showing Germany as it existed immediately after World War II. And what's important to me here is that that's Berlin. And the what now became the West Germans wanted to keep contact with Berlin, their former capital. And as the Russians, very shortly after the war, became very hard to deal with, they were able to negotiate a system of corridors that would always ensure safety for flying in and out of Berlin. Now, there were 3 corridors, one from the American zone, the South Corridor, the exit zone out the middle corridor, and the North Corridor from the British zone. In yellow, you see the American zone. In blue, the French zone was kind of added on after the war. They were not one of the big 3 in the war, but they became part of the Western Allies after the war. And I was to use that corridor many times. So next slide, please. I put this slide in because this is a memorial to all the people that lost their lives while flying in or in Berlin during the use of the corridor. From 1945 until 1989, the corridor was in use. Mainly, its main contribution was the Berlin airlift of 48 and 49, when the Russians sealed off, or attempted to seal off Berlin. Next slide, please. Now, in this squadron, at first Wiesbaden and then Ramstein, we supported the president of Germany by flying him in and out of Berlin. The German Air Force could not fly in the East Zone over the Russian sector. We also supported the American ambassador, who we took in and out of Moscow. And we supported the military commanders of an organization called CENTO. Next slide. This is the German president that was the only one that I flew. Herr Dr. Walter Scheel was a very gentlemanly gentleman. This is, the pilot here is on his last trip. And he wanted to become a civilian airline pilot in Europe. And he'd asked the president for a letter of recommendation. And believe it or not, the president gave it to him. And so he was, we all thought of him as a pretty super guy, although the political power didn't really rest with him. That was with the chancellor, who I never flew. Next slide, please. I'll always remember one trip flying the president. I probably flew him 10 or 15 times in my 4 years. Security was always very tight. A lot of it you didn't see, but it was definitely there. One trip, the president asked 40 or so West Germans to accompany him to spend a day and a night in Berlin and see what life in Berlin was like. So that was the only time I spent a night in Berlin. We stayed with the airplane. So the next day we flew to Frankfurt and dropped off the folks, and the president's private secretary approached me as we were offloading and said, "I'm sorry, but I don't have any mementos for the crew. I got so involved with these passengers." And I said, "No problem, we've all gotten stuff in the past." And he said, "Well, the president actually had a birthday party for me on the airplane. It was my birthday yesterday. And we have about a case and a half of the president's private label wine left, and I'd like to give that to the crew as your memento." And I said, "Okay, fine, the flight steward will take care of that." And so I hoped that was the end of the story. But as he discovered and we flew back, the entire first part of the flight was trying to figure out how we were going to divide up these bottles of wine. It didn't come out even. We always, no matter what we did, we came out with 2 bottles extra. So I really got tired of listening to this discussion about why, and of course everybody had a real good reason why they should get an extra bottle. And so I'm kind of joking, but I thought, well, I got to come up with some creative way not to cause discontent among the crew, but I'm not sure what to do. Finally, as we got closer to Ramstein, I said, "Okay, guys, back to business now. Get your checklists out, do everything perfect, because when we land, I'm going to tell you how we're going to divide this up." So we pull into the parking lot. We didn't have any passengers. I set the parking brake. I said, now make sure you run your checklist. Do not open any doors. Everybody come to the aft flight deck, and we're going to drink those last 2 bottles of wine. And that's exactly what we did. And so then got off, went over to the squadron, and never got any kicks about that. But as I'm walking down the hallway at the squadron, one of the German secretaries said, "Oh, Captain Anderson, I saw you yesterday in Berlin. You look so nice in your uniform." And in my sort of smart-ass personage, I said, "Yeah, you'd think that the president's pilot could at least get a phone in this country." Well, we'd had a huge migration of people from Wiesbaden to Ramstein, and we were tail end Charlie, so there was hard to find housing. Nobody had phones. Well, she must have called the phone company, which was really the post office that ran everything like that, and they called my landlord and asked if they could put in a party line. So when I got home that night, his son, who spoke some English, tried to describe to me that I was going to get a phone. Well, I wasn't quite sure what he was saying, but I said, okay, well, fine, thanks. Next day, when I got home, I had a phone. Amazing. It could be done. Okay, next slide, please. Support for the American ambassador in and out of Moscow. And as a relatively junior captain in a fairly senior squadron, the captains usually flew the winter flights. And the majors and colonels, they flew the summer and spring flights. So I never saw Moscow when it wasn't either snow or ice bound. This is Red Square with St. Basil's Cathedral in the background. And now if I was to do a 90-degree left turn, and you look at the inset photo, that's Lenin's tomb in the background, and then farther to the right of that picture would be the Kremlin. The inset picture, there's a little story with these groups of Russians, like this one and that one, would sometimes come great distances just to view Lenin's tomb. And the day that I took the inset picture, I was wearing my red ski jacket, and I had about 5 cameras around my neck taking turns, taking pictures of my crew. And a Russian came up to me and started very dramatically saying something to me. So I called the attaché over and I said, "What does this guy want?" And he said, after talking to him, he said he thinks you're the people's photographer, and he wants you to take pictures of his group that had to spend 2 days on a train ride to come here to see Lenin's tomb. I said, "I'd be glad to take his picture." He goes, No. This guy'd get in big trouble if they see an American taking his picture. So that was the end of that story. Next slide. We always spent 2 days in Moscow so that the embassy could handle and log in all the classified stuff that we brought them, and then they could log out all the stuff they wanted to send out with us. And so I think this picture was the exception to the snow. This was pure ice. They'd had freezing rain, the runway, the ramp was just so slick you could barely stand up. And offloading and unloading was a big problem. So we were all pretty happy when our classified, I think we had put a bunch of blankets down over the ice so that we could stand up. Next slide, please. Our other standing mission was support of CENTO, which no longer exists. But it was, in those days, it was the US, the UK, Turkey, Pakistan, and Iran that had a sort of a treaty organization. It was centered in Ankara, Turkey. There was a 3-star general from each country that was in turns every 6 months, the commander of that outfit, and rotation. We flew many missions. I don't think I ever flew one within Turkey, but we usually would fly to Tehran and either from there fly throughout the various places that I went in Tehran. You've all heard about most of them on the TV or radio recently. And then sometimes we would go downrange to 1 or 2 places in Pakistan. I only remember really one trip that stood out in great memory. It was right before Christmas. We flew to Ankara. It was nice weather. The next morning we woke up and there were 6 inches of snow. It was like Denver, Colorado in elevation. Not quite that high, but quite high elevation. So we go out to the airport like to be ready to go 2 hours ahead of time as we normally were. And our airplane's covered with snow. And so we were discussing how we were going to get this snow off the wings, principally. But we had a handling agent there who said he could take care of that. He had a 55-gallon drum of de-icing fluid with a small putt-putt motor. He put that up on a forklift as high as it would go, and he stood up there and sprayed the wings. Well, it didn't really knock the snow off. It just made everything pink because it was red fluid. So there we are with this pink airplane. And in less than 2 hours, we were going to have all these generals. Well, luckily the sun did come out and started to melt. And so the wings pretty much took care of themselves, but the fuselage was still covered with snow and pink because it hadn't warmed up enough to melt it off. So there we start out the trip with a pink airplane. But as we taxied out and as the heat came through and the passengers were on board, pretty much everything fell off. So we were okay to go. Well, that's not the end of the story. The end of the story was we ended up at Bandar Abbas, Iran, down on the Persian Gulf, beautiful weather. We land, the Iranian Navy was supposed to support us. They couldn't figure out how to push the passenger steps up to the passenger door. Tried and tried, they couldn't figure out, I don't know what it was to unlock it, or it was all rusted up. So, I don't know if desperation isn't quite the right word, but my flight engineer opened the emergency escape door just behind the cockpit and went down on the rope down to the ground and tried to help them. Couldn't make any progress, but he saw a maintenance stand, which is a very steep, little narrow, almost like a ladder with one little railing. And he pushed that up to the escape door, and that's how everybody got off. And the generals had their wives with them. So the 5 wives, the generals, their staff, and my whole crew got off going down that little narrow ladder. Every one of them was a real trooper. Nobody complained. We got down, everything was fine. Spent 2 beautiful days at Bandar Abbas eating wonderful seafood, and cranked up and got out of there. And on the way, this is a different trip, but on the way back we lost an engine. And so the whole engine had to be changed. We'd aborted on takeoff out of Tehran. And so we're waiting day after day for this new engine. We started running out of money because, I was a senior guy, I was a junior captain. I had a checking account at least. Some of the guys had not much money with them. So the NCOIC said, hey, my guys are out of money. How are we going to pay for our meal tonight? So I contacted the Iranian general's office, and they said, oh, he'll be happy to countersign a check for you. And that's how I looked at my checking account. I didn't want to bounce a check on this. So I didn't have that much money, maybe $400 or $500. So I cashed that, and we spread that out amongst the crew, and that's how we got. During the time that we were waiting for this engine, these generals, they wanted to go back to Ankara. So they had a smaller airplane that they needed a flight steward for. So they, unbeknownst to me, they took one of my flight stewards. So when we finally got the crew back together and we got repaired and ready to go, they say, oh yeah, by the way, we took your flight steward 3 days ago, and he didn't get the proper paperwork stamped when he went into Turkey. So he's under arrest in Turkey. And yeah, you can imagine that the aircraft commander was a little upset about that, because I kind of really felt responsible for my guys. So they said, well, it's not really that bad. When I kind of hit the ceiling, he says he's actually under house arrest at Incirlik, which was our next stop, or after Ankara. And so the normal procedure was they're very easy on us in a way. You had your orders stamped that you entered Turkey legally, very little customs and so on. And then you just pressed on. Well, he didn't have his orders with him, or he didn't have them stamped. Everybody else was stationed in Turkey. And so for whatever reason, headquarters had sent him down to the civilian airport outside Incirlik so that he could get back with us, in theory. And he didn't have orders. So at Adana Airport, they arrested him for illegal entry into Turkey. And he happened to be a Puerto Rican. And he kind of looked a little Turkish. So they had no mercy on him. But he kept saying he's, American. So the security police at Incirlik came out and picked him up and brought him back to the base and told him, well, don't go anywhere till your crew gets here. So we go to Incirlik, pick him up, and the rest of it just normal. Next slide, please. But that was an example of a lot of things that headquarters did. They thought they planned trips right, toss it in your lap in your briefing, and, oh, by the way, you have to do this, and they left it up to the crew to make it happen. Our other big job, there's no really normal flying with courier flights down to Spain and down to Turkey. I flew one time as co-pilot for the squadron commander to Turkey, and on our way back to Athens, we had to shut down an engine. Not a big deal, although it was one of the few times that had happened. The only time I think it happened to me with an in-flight shutdown. We land, order parts, and go to the hotel. Next day, we go out expecting our parts to be there. Nope, sorry, no parts, didn't make it out of Germany. Come back tomorrow. As we're ready to go back to the hotel, a World War II B-24 taxis onto the American ramp. Security police surrounded. It was there legally, but they were 6 weeks late. And once that was straightened out, my squadron commander wanted to talk to the crew. He had flown B-24s in World War II. And so he was saying, well, this was an H model. I flew the G model, but he wanted to see that airplane. And they said, okay, fine, have at it. We crawled all over that thing. Meanwhile, he's telling stories about his flights in World War II. So that was a good history lesson for me. But I touched on other parts of history, and the Yom Kippur War, I heard the Russians doing their airlift down to Syria and Cairo. They were on a same frequency that I needed to use. I never got on that frequency because they were just motor mouthing all the time on that frequency. And the next elbow against history was the Cyprus problems. The Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots were having a war, or not really a war, but a lot of fighting in 1974. As a result, Greece closed its airspace to anybody coming out of Turkey. So we rerouted as far south as we could go along the edge of the Greek airspace and refueled at Sigonella, Italy. Not a big problem. But the next time I flew coming out of Turkey, we were about 300 miles south of Athens, and the radio, we kept air traffic control with Athens. They said, contact Athene base ops on such and such VHF frequency. Well, it was way out of range, so we called headquarters, and they said, yes, divert to Athens. So we diverted, the navigator's talking to headquarters, and he says they want to know our fuel requirements and meal requirements to fly to Mildenhall, England. So the navigator and the engineer worked up the numbers. We land at Athens. The Athene base ops guy comes out and meets us. He says, you're going to pick up 4 passengers, and as soon as you're refueled, get the heck out of here. So then I see 4 guys in flight suits get off the C-135, which I knew was a reconnaissance airplane, similar mission over in that part of the world than I'd done in Vietnam. And these 4 guys walk across the ramp, get on my airplane, we crank up and get the heck out of there. en route to Mildenhall. We take off. Tower clears us over to departure control. And departure control, we check in. He says, state the nature of your mission. And I look at the co-pilot, and what are we going to say? I said, well, tell him we were headquarters directed. Well, no, state the nature of your mission. So we make up some other innocuous sounding answer. And we haven't gotten our en route clearance. We needed that clearance. So he says one more time, what was the nature of your mission? I said, I got this. So I said, I'm sorry, sir, I can't discuss this on the radio, but I have a telephone number you can call at Athene Base Ops, which I didn't have. But he's, oh, excuse me, sir. I'm sorry, sir. You're cleared to destination via such and such and such and such. So he was just as curious about it as we were. And when we landed at Mildenhall, these 4 guys got off our airplane and walked right over to another C-130 reconnaissance plane, and they went all the way to Washington. Never found out what they had. Also never found out what troubled waters they smoothed by what they had. So it was a double mystery. Next slide, please. The most memorable I flew a lot of generals and a lot of high-ranking civilians and distinguished visitors. But the one I remember the most was General Ellis, who was the new commander of the United States Air Forces in all of Europe. We were called, I was at another base dropping off the band for a change of command ceremony, and I got a call at base ops as we were waiting, and he said, we want to know, this is headquarters scheduling, we want to know if you could be crew rested for an early morning flight tomorrow to Paris. And I said, yeah, should be no problem. What time? He said, well, it's an 8 o'clock takeoff. I said, yeah, no problem. Where is it? And he said, well, it's a French fighter base just outside Paris. And it turned out it was near Versailles. So I said, okay. So I looked at the chart, and it was, and he said, well, that's because the weather's a problem, and you've got lower minimums than the T-39 that he usually flies. I said, okay. I looked at the chart, and it's printed in brown, the call letters. I said, well, that's a VFR base. Doesn't matter what minimums there are. You got to be 1,503 visual rules. He said, oh, well, we'll get an approach for you. Don't worry about it. I said, okay. So it's probably 6 o'clock the next morning. Duty officer says, here, I got all this material about your airport. And it had everything except the minimums. Apparently, the air attaché who chased all that stuff down wasn't a pilot. So I told the duty officer, said, okay, I've been thinking about this all night. We'll just put on enough gas to go over there. If approach control can't tell me what the minimums for their precision approach radar, which we knew they had, if we can't get in that way, we'll just come back. He says, okay. And he passed that on to headquarters. But it was no problem. We got in okay. Next day, the general goes to his meetings. The next day, we take off for Orange, which is a base down in southern France. Again, the weather was great. We land. The general and Mrs. Ellis get off the plane, go to their meetings. And I think we had a 2 or 3 o'clock schedule, 3 o'clock, let's say, scheduled takeoff time. We're all back on the plane at 2, ready to go. French were great hosts. And Mrs. Ellis and the aides were already on the plane, and the motorcade starts approaching about 2:30, and so I run down the steps, and I'm standing there with my best salute as a general. He literally jumps out of the car and marches as fast as anybody could march, right up beside me at the steps. And I'll swear he did an about face to face the French that were just getting out of their cars. And he turns, and this is a direct quote, turns his head just like this and says, "Get this goddamn thing out of here right now." So I turned to the steward who was at the top of the steps, and I said, "Start number 3. So as I ran up the steps and got into the cockpit, the engineer and the co-pilot had started number 3, and it started smoothing out. But, it made a lot of smoke, a lot of noise, which I think is exactly what he wanted. I don't know what transpired with the French to lead him to do that. I don't know if he ever met the French or just got on the plane and left. But we buttoned up as soon as we could, started the other engines, taxied out, took off. I left the seatbelt sign on for quite a while because we expected turbulence from some mountains that we were going to fly over shortly after takeoff. Sure enough, we got this one whack. I mean, it sounded like that, or louder, and just that one shot. So I asked on the interphone, called the steward. I said, "Everybody okay in back?" He says, "Everybody's okay except Mrs. Ellis, who got coffee splashed all over her lap." And then he said, "Yeah, when that happened, I thought I saw my stripes just flying away," until the general unmercifully chewed out his wife for getting out of the chair with a seatbelt sign on. So he was a pretty tough guy. And everything went fine after that. We land, he gets off, and as I was getting ready to leave, the senior flight attendant, flight steward, comes up. We had all guys, and he says, Captain Anderson, I have this package from the safe. The safe was open, and I've had it. And he handed me this, looked like about a ream of paper, and it was wrapped and it had secrets stamped all over it. And I thought, oh God. So now I've got a handful of secrets that one of his aides left in the safe. So I go to the squadron, and I didn't want to be walking around with secrets that weren't authorized for me. So I told the duty officer, I said, I got these secrets. I don't want to bring it to the local command post because somebody will really get burned over it. I don't want to take it to the USAF command post, same reason. So I think I'll drive over to the general's house and drop it off. And I knew where the senior housing area was, and I went there, dropped it off. The general answered the door. I told him who I was. I gave him, he says, "Thanks very much, Captain," and closed the door right in my face. And I went home happy that I got rid of that. Never got any comebacks on it. It was getting late in the career, as I'm getting late in the briefing.
Yes, I hate to feel like I'm calling off the mission.
Yeah.
And by the way, I was totally enthralled by so much of this talk. It was like listening to a mini-series, right? You could picture it in your head as like this mini-series on TV or something. Fantastic. You're kidding me? But unfortunately, we probably need to call it here and say, take it up on at a future date. Is that okay?
Yep. Yeah, I think that would be a good way to do it, because I do have a lot of material on flying the C-5.
Yeah.
I'll just finish up real quick here.
Sure.
by saying I had flown, the Supreme Allied Commander of all NATO forces in Europe has always been, and probably at least through now, always been an American four-star general. At the time I was in Europe, it was General Alexander Haig. He was not a particularly friendly guy to the crew as others had been. Of all the DVs, he was the most stern, I suppose you could say. And the day he had two pilots for his special airplane. And if one of those pilots couldn't fly, they would call to Ramstein and ask for a co-pilot to come up on the train, stand by, or fly as the need may be. And I did that 2 or 3 times. And towards the end of my career, we'd taken all the C-118s back to the boneyard. So I was just waiting to go home from my tour. And I got the call. I went up to Brussels the day that the ORI started at Ramstein. They had a new wing commander, and he wanted an ORI to find out the strength or weaknesses of his staff. So about day 3 up there, I'm alerted. We fly down to Ramstein with General Haig. Gets off the airplane, goes to the headquarters for discussions, leaving Russ, the pilot, his pilot, and I shut down the airplane with the engineer, go talk to who's the guys in the back. Well, there's 2 colonels I don't recognize. Russ says, "Dave, you'll find this interesting. I'd like you to meet the vice wing commander here at Ramstein and the director of operations." I said, "That is interesting, because 3 days ago there were different guys doing those jobs." And he said, yeah, well, we didn't get here till 8:30 last night driving in from Brussels. In other words, after the outbriefing of our ORI. So I went over to the squadron. My friend told me that they had busted their ORI big time. And he said, but the best part was when General Ellis came in after the outbriefing, and he said hello to the new wing commander, walked across the aisle to the former, or the older in-place guys, and he said, you're fired, and you're fired, and you're fired, and get out of my theater of operations within 72 hours. And my friend said, and I'll bet you there's moving vans at their houses right now. Well, I couldn't resist. I had 2 hours before we were going to go back. So I jumped in my car and drove out to the senior housing area, and sure enough, there were moving vans at those houses. So I go back, get on the plane, ready to take the SACUR back to Brussels, and the pilot says, hey, Dave, this might be your last chance. How about flying the leg back to Brussels? So that was my last C-118 flight. Over.
And out.
Thank you. If there's any questions, maybe there are, I will try to be down in the coffee area after I finish my debriefing.
Good on you. Well, as I've already said, I just thought it was such an exceptional talk. It was so vivid. It just didn't it cause images to come in your head of the scenes he was describing and the war and everything? And it really was like listening to a miniseries, mate. It was fantastic.
Maybe we could have enough slides to at least show a picture of a C-5.
There you go.
This is a picture of a C-5 being refueled by a KC-135.
Did you ever do that, mid-air refueling?
This is actually, he's plugged in right now. He's probably at the far end of his little box that he's supposed to fly in, about a 20 by 20 by 20 box to keep that fueling plugged in. He'll come in a little closer probably, but this is a pretty good picture just to show the size relationship. And the important thing in refueling, you'd come into about 50 feet behind the tanker and stop. That would allow the tanker's autopilot to start correcting for the bow wave pressure. And so you wouldn't break the autopilot, because you never wanted to fly against a hand-flown tanker. Just about impossible for him to hold a steady platform for you to refuel on. So, and if I'm allowed to come back next year, I will give the second part of my briefing, maybe called something like, do you speak C5? Because it's such a unique airplane that even a lot of our ground crews, and particularly the command and control people, really weren't very comfortable dealing with it.
I think you should write up that talk and submit it as a mini-series on Netflix or something. It was really amazing talk. Before you stand up, just let us present this small certificate of our deep appreciation.